It is the morning of September 20th, 1797, on the waterfront of Boston's North End. A crowd is gathered along the harbor to watch the young United States put its most expensive object into the water for the first time. On the building ways stands a frigate the country has spent 3 years and a fortune it barely had trying to finish. Her naval constructor, George Claghorn, gives the order. The shores are knocked away. The ship begins to move. And then, after 27 feet, she stops. Her own weight has pressed the launchways down into the ground beneath her, and the greased timbers that were supposed to carry her into the harbor have settled just enough to trap her. She sits there, half-launched, in front of the whole city. 2 days later, they try again, and she travels barely 30 feet more before stopping a second time. The most powerful warship America has ever attempted is stuck on dry land, held there by the very thing that will one day make her unbreakable. Because everything about this ship was built heavy on purpose. The wood was chosen to be denser than any warship timber in the world. The frames were packed so tightly there was almost no gap between them. The hull at the waterline was made more than 2 feet thick. That weight is why she could not move. It is also why, 15 years later, enemy cannonballs would appear to bounce off her side and give her a name that has lasted more than 2 centuries. This is the story of the machines that built Old Ironsides. To understand why a warship ended up stuck on dry land in 1797, you have to go back 3 years to a country that had almost no navy at all and a very good reason to be afraid. In the early 1790s, the young United States had a merchant fleet out on the Atlantic and nothing to protect it. Along the coast of North Africa, corsairs operating out of Algiers were seizing American ships, taking their cargoes and holding their crews for ransom. Sailors from a nation that had just fought a revolution for its freedom were being sold into captivity, and the government in Philadelphia could do almost nothing about it. There was no fleet to send. There were no warships to build one around. So on March 27, 1794, President George Washington signed the Naval Act. It authorized 6 frigates. 4 of them were to carry 44 guns each. The other 2 were to carry 36. One of those 4 larger ships would eventually be named Constitution. This single piece of paper is the true beginning of the United States Navy, and it is the reason the whole story exists. But the Naval Act almost destroyed the very ships it created. The country was bitterly divided over whether it should have a navy at all. To many in Congress, 6 warships meant a permanent standing military, endless expense, and a temptation toward foreign wars. They only agreed to the act because of a single condition written directly into the law. If the United States made peace with Algiers, the reason for the ships would be gone, and construction was to stop immediately. It was Clause 9, and it was a loaded gun pointed at the frigates from the day they were born. For 2 years, the 6 ships came together slowly in shipyards up and down the coast. And then, in March 1796, the thing the shipbuilders feared actually happened. A peace agreement was announced between the United States and Algiers. Under Clause 9, that was the end. The law was clear. Work on all 6 frigates was ordered halted. Years of effort, mountains of timber, and a fortune in public money were about to be abandoned on the building ways. Washington refused to let it die quietly. He believed a nation without a navy was a nation at the mercy of anyone with a fleet. And he stalled, arguing that stopping the work outright would waste everything already spent and serve nobody's interest. In Congress, the fight was real. Many members wanted the Navy gone, the half-built hulls sold off. The whole experiment ended before it could cost another dollar. The compromise came on April 20th, 1796. Congress agreed to keep building, but only the 3 ships closest to being finished. The United States, the Constellation, and the Constitution would be completed. The other 3 were set aside. Old Ironsides survived by being far enough along that killing her looked more wasteful than finishing her. So the ship that would become the most famous warship in American history reached her launch day already carrying a strange history. She had been authorized to fight pirates, nearly canceled by peace with those same pirates, and saved only because stopping was more expensive than continuing. But surviving on paper was the easy part. Now the men in the shipyards had to actually build her. And Washington's government had demanded something no navy in the world had ever attempted. These frigates were not meant to simply match the warships of Britain and France. They were meant to be stronger than anything their size afloat, tough enough to beat what they could catch and fast enough to escape what they could not. To do that, the builders needed a material harder than any warship timber on Earth. And to get it, they went to a place most Americans had never heard of and put the work into hands that had no choice but to do it. A warship is only as strong as the trees it is made from, and the men who designed Constitution knew exactly which tree they wanted. It did not grow anywhere near Boston. The frame of the ship, the skeleton that everything else would be fastened to, was to be built from southern live oak. Live oak is not like the tall, straight oak of a New England forest. It is a low, sprawling coastal tree that grows dense and heavy and full of natural curves. Its wood is so tightly grained that it resists rot in a way ordinary timber cannot, and it is far heavier and harder than the white oak most warships were built from. A frame made of live oak could be packed together with almost no space between the timbers, and a hull frame that closely could carry a crushing weight of guns and still hold its shape at sea. There was only one problem. Live oak grew in the warm coastal south, on the islands off Georgia, hundreds of miles from the shipyards that needed it, and getting it out of those forests was some of the hardest and most dangerous work in the country. The Navy pursued its timber on the remote coastal islands of Georgia, and the most important of them was St. Simon's Island. There, crews were sent into dense, humid, insect-ridden forests to find, fell, and shape live oaks that could weigh many tons apiece. The trees had to be cut, then hewn into the exact curved frame pieces the ship's plans called for, then hauled out of the swampy ground and down to the water to be shipped north. It was brutal labor in a brutal climate, and it went on for the better part of 100 trees, then hundreds more. In the end, the timber of roughly 2,000 live oak trees went into a single ship. And here's the part of the story that most retellings pass over in a single sentence. That work was done by enslaved people. On the Georgia islands, the dangerous, grueling job of cutting the live oak that framed Old Ironsides fell to men who were owned, who were given no choice, and whose names were mostly never written down. The ship that would become the proudest symbol of American freedom was framed with timber pulled from the ground by people who had none. It is not a detail added on afterward by modern historians looking for something to criticize. The records of the shipyards and the timber contracts show it plainly, and the physical proof is still there today. Wood cut by enslaved hands remains inside the hull of the USS Constitution right now, holding the ship together more than 2 centuries later. It is worth sitting with that for a moment before moving on, because the machine we are describing was not only made of oak and iron and copper, it was made of forced labor, and the strength everyone would later celebrate was quarried out of the forest by people the country refused to free. The live oak did exactly what the designers hoped. Packed tightly into the frame, it gave the ship a hull that could take punishment no lighter warship could survive. But wood alone, no matter how hard, does not make a fighting ship. Those 2,000 trees were still just a pile of heavy curved timbers stacked at a shipyard in Boston. Someone still had to turn them into a hull, and the man in charge of that yard was about to build the frame in a way that broke with almost everything shipwrights thought they knew. The live oak came north to a shipyard in Boston's North End owned by a builder named Edmund Hart. This is where the timber stopped being lumber and started becoming a warship, and the man responsible for putting it together was the ship's naval constructor, George Claghorn. But the plan Claghorn was building to did not come from Boston. It came from a Philadelphia ship designer named Joshua Humphreys, and it was one of the boldest ideas in the history of wooden warships. Humphreys looked at the navies of Europe and saw a simple rule that everyone accepted. Warships came in classes. A frigate was a fast medium ship that could outrun anything strong enough to beat it and outfight anything fast enough to catch it. A ship of the line was a slow, heavy giant that could stand in a battle line and trade broadsides. You picked one or the other. You could be fast or you could be strong. Humphreys refused to accept that trade. He designed a frigate that broke the rule, a ship rated for 44 guns but built longer, heavier, and far stronger than any frigate afloat, so that it could destroy smaller warships and simply outrun the giant ships of the line that might otherwise crush it. The danger in that idea was structural. A wooden ship is under enormous stress the moment it floats. The water pushes up hardest in the middle where the hull is deepest, while the heavy bow and stern want to droop toward the sea. Over years, this slowly bends a long wooden hull out of shape, a problem shipwrights called hogging. The longer you build the ship, the worse it gets. Humphreys was proposing to build a frigate longer than anyone thought a frigate could safely be. His answer is one of the reasons the ship still exists. Other navies already use short diagonal braces here and there to stiffen a hull. Humphreys took the idea further than anyone before him. Inside the hull, running the full length from the keel up to the lower deck beams, he specified long, one-piece, pre-stressed timbers called diagonal riders, 3 pairs forward and 3 pairs aft. Instead of relying only on the vertical and horizontal timbers that framed every ship, these diagonal members tied the structure together across its length, resisting the slow droop that destroyed lesser hulls. It was, in effect, an internal skeleton bracing the outer one, and it let the ship carry her length and her weight without bending herself apart. We know exactly how well it worked because the ship told us 2 centuries later. When Constitution went into dry dock for a major restoration in 1992, her keel had finally hogged, bending upward by about 14 inches over the years. During that restoration, her diagonal riders were rebuilt and reinstalled, and when she came back out of dry dock in 1996, the hog had been pulled back to 0. Humphreys' 200-year-old idea straightened the ship's own spine. Then there was the wall of the ship itself. Because the live oak frames were set so closely together and because the planking laid over them ran up to 7 inches thick, the finished hull at the waterline was built more than 2 feet thick. 2 feet of dense, layered, salt-hardened oak. This was not armor in the modern sense. There was no iron plate on the outside of the ship. It was simply so much solid, tightly packed timber that a cannonball striking it had to punch through a barrier thicker and harder than anything a frigate was supposed to have. That thickness had a cost, and it is the cost that would strand the ship on land. All of this timber, packed this tightly, made Constitution extraordinarily heavy for her size. Every design choice that made her strong also made her a burden to move. On the water, it would make her nearly unstoppable. On the building ways, it would very nearly refuse to move at all. The frame was rising in Hart's Yard now, a dense cage of live oak braced with diagonal riders, waiting to be locked together into a single rigid body. But you cannot hold a warship together with wooden pegs alone. The forces at sea would tear them out. To fasten the greatest wooden hull America had ever built, the shipwrights needed thousands of pieces of worked metal, and they turned to a craftsman whose name every American already knew, though not for this. Most Americans know Paul Revere for One Night on Horseback in 1775. Almost nobody knows that 20 years later he was running one of the most important metalworks in the country, and that his copper is buried throughout the hull of Old Ironsides. By the 1790s, Revere had turned from silversmith into industrialist. He worked iron, he cast bronze, and he was building the skill that would soon let him do something no American had done before, roll sheet copper on a large scale. For a warship, that expertise was not a luxury, it was structural necessity. A hull the size of Constitution could not be held together with wooden pegs, called tree nails, alone. The stress of a heavy ship working in a seaway would loosen and shear ordinary fastenings over time. The frame needed thousands of metal fastenings, spikes to hold planks to timbers, and long bolts driven through the structure to lock the great members together. And those fastenings could not be iron. Iron rusts, and worse, in a wooden hull soaked in salt water, iron fastenings corrode and eat away the very wood around them, quietly rotting the ship from the inside. The answer was copper, which resists that corrosion, and Paul Revere supplied it. He forged the copper spikes and bolts that fastened Constitution's planking to her live oak frame. These were not small parts. A ship this size needed them by the thousand in many lengths and thicknesses. Each one worked to hold under enormous load. By the time the finished frigate first put to sea in 1798, Revere had provided more than 8,000 pounds of bolts, spikes, and staples to Constitution alone. 4 tons of copper, hand-worked, driven into the hull to keep the timber from ever coming apart. This is the quiet truth of how great ships are actually built. The parts that make them legendary, the guns and the sails and the towering masts, sit on top of thousands of unseen fastenings that nobody ever thinks about. Pull those out and the whole machine falls to pieces in the first heavy sea. The copper Revere drove into Old Ironsides is still doing its job, holding live oak to live oak 2 centuries after he made it. While the fastenings went in, the rest of the ship took shape around the frame. The outer planking was laid on and spiked down. The decks went in. The great timbers that would carry the mast were stepped into the bottom of the hull, and the internal structure that would bear the recoil of dozens of heavy guns was locked into place. Every part of it was built to the same standard as the frame, heavier and stronger than a frigate needed to be, because the whole point of the design was to be able to take a beating that would sink anything else her size. Slowly, in Edmund Hart's yard, a finished hull emerged. It was the strongest wooden warship America had ever built, framed in enslaved cut live oak, braced with Humphreys' diagonal riders, and bolted together with 4 tons of Paul Revere's copper. 3 years of work and a fortune in public money were standing on the ways, complete at the edge of the harbor. Now all they had to do was the one thing that should have been simple. They had to put her in the water. And the ship that had been designed to survive anything the sea could throw at her was about to prove almost impossible to launch. A launch is the most dangerous moment in a wooden ship's life. Until that instant, the hull has rested on solid ground, its enormous weight spread across the building ways. The launch asked the ship to slide down a greased ramp under its own weight and float free, and everything the builders did to make Constitution strong had also made her one of the heaviest objects of her size ever built. On the morning of September 20th, 1997, that weight came due. The ways were greased. The crowd was waiting. George Claghorn gave the order and the shores were struck away. For a moment it worked. The ship began to slide toward the harbor, and then, after just 27 feet, she stopped. The problem was underneath her. The tremendous weight of the hull had pressed the launchways down into the ground, and as the timber settled, the smooth slope that was supposed to carry her into the water sagged and bound. The ship was simply too heavy for the ramp built to launch her. She sat there 27 feet from where she started, going nowhere, with the whole city watching. 2 days later, on September 22nd, they tried again. Crews worked to free her and set her moving, and again she slid and again she stopped. This second attempt gained only about 31 more feet before the same thing happened. In 2 tries across 2 days, the most powerful warship in America had traveled less than 60 feet, and she was still not in the water. It was the kind of public failure that could have become the whole story of the ship, a monument to a young country trying to build beyond its means. The fix was not clever, it was labor. If the ways settled under the ship's weight, then the ways had to be rebuilt to carry that weight and steepen so gravity could do more of the work. Shipyard crews went back to the ramp and reconstructed it, increasing the angle so the hull would have a stronger pull toward the harbor. It took weeks. The ship waited, half-launched, while the men who built her rebuilt the ground beneath her. They did not try again until the tide was right. On October 21st, 1997, at high water, with the harbor risen as far as it would come to meet her, they launched the ship a third time. This time the steeper ways held their shape, the tide gave her the depth she needed, and the enormous hull finally slid the rest of the way down and floated free into Boston Harbor. 3 attempts, more than a month between the first and the last. The ship that had survived a cancellation, that had been framed with enslaved cut oak and bolted with 4 tons of copper, had very nearly been beaten by the simplest step of all, getting off the land. But she was afloat now, and the same crushing weight that had trapped her on the ways, the dense live oak, the tightly packed frame, the hull built more than 2 feet thick, was about to become the most important thing about her. 15 years later, in a battle nobody in that Boston shipyard could have imagined, that weight would do exactly what Joshua Humphreys designed it to do, and it would give the ship a name that has outlived everyone who built her. For 15 years after her troubled launch, Constitution did the work she was built for. She fought pirates in the Mediterranean, exactly the enemy the Naval Act had named. She carried the flag of a country still deciding whether it deserved a navy at all. And then, in the summer of 1812, the United States went to war with the greatest naval power on earth, and the strange, oversized, impossibly heavy design finally met the test it was made for. On August 19, 1812, Constitution met the British frigate Guerriere in the open Atlantic. The 2 ships closed and traded fire, and something happened that the crew would never forget. British cannonballs fired at close range struck Constitution's side and appeared to bounce off. 2 feet of dense, salt-hardened live oak, framed so tightly it was almost solid, did exactly what Joshua Humphreys had designed it to do. The shot could not get through. According to the story handed down ever since, a sailor watching the enemy's iron fall away from the hull shouted that her sides were made of iron. She was not iron. She was wood, chosen and packed and braced to behave like iron. From that day, she was Old Ironsides. Everything that nearly killed the ship turned out to be the reason she won. The heavy live oak that trapped her on the launchways stopped the cannonballs. The oversized design that Congress almost canceled made her stronger than anything her size. The diagonal riders that let her carry that length kept her hull true through decades of pounding at sea. The 4 tons of Revere's copper held her together through it all. The machine worked. Every costly, difficult, dangerous choice made during those 3 years in Hart's Yard paid off in a single afternoon. And unlike almost every other wooden warship of her age, she was never allowed to rot away or be broken up. She was repaired, rebuilt, and preserved, generation after generation, until she became something no other ship in the world could claim. Today, the USS Constitution is the oldest commissioned warship still afloat anywhere on Earth, still crewed by the United States Navy, still resting in the water of Boston Harbor, not far from the North End Yard where she was so nearly lost. In 2026, as the United States marks its 250th year, the oldest ship in its Navy is once again at the center of the story, a machine built in the first decade of the Republic that is still floating in the 3rd century of it. But remember what she is actually made of. She is live oak cut on the Georgia coast by enslaved people who were given no choice and mostly no names. She is the copper of a man remembered for a horse ride. She is the stubborn design of an engineer who refused to accept the rules, built by shipwrights who had to rebuild the ground itself to get her into the water. Old Ironsides is not a legend that happened. She is a machine that was made at a real cost by real hands, and the fact that she still floats is the last proof of just how well she was built.